What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome back to the channel. We've got a lot to talk about today, and this is something that is kind of hitting close to home because if you know me and you know all of my streams and stuff, you know that like halftime and hip-hop swing is something that I've struggled with forever. It's something that I've always aspired to achieve just because, for one, I admire the sound, but two, because I grew up with a lot of this kind of music. But I think that there is so much value in really finding your roots within hip-hop if you are an electronic producer. And chances are, if you are an electronic producer, at one point or another in time, you've most likely created a hip-hop tune, whether it be amazing or kind of whatever. I always say that if you have beat block or something, then you should try to make lo-fi hip-hop and stuff because it's relatively easy to make and that, but it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of depth into creating some of the vibes or creating that, putting soul into quote-unquote the aspects of hip-hop. Now today, these beats are in a bunch of different styles. However you want to categorize them is just however you hear them in your head, so I'm going to try not to like be too specific on what they're supposed to be, but I do think that you will notice some striking similarities between some of your favorite genres that you like to listen to. With that being said, before I go on, I would highly suggest that you guys go watch the YouTube channel The Daydream Sound. This is kind of something that helped me click what I was doing and what I was trying to achieve with a lot of what was going on within these videos, and I cannot continue any further without giving that YouTuber some credit. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at these beats, and feel free to subscribe and interact with the channel while we're taking this listen. And once we're done with that, we're going to check out how to kind of bring the aesthetics out of these beats. Maybe you've heard these beats before, and maybe there are some that you haven't heard, but these are just a bunch of different kind of rhythms to try, and we're going to kind of dive in and analyze some of the aesthetics that make some of these what they are. So let's go ahead and start with the first beat. Pretty much the way that this came out was that the kick and the snare are kind of bang on, and most of the beats on here are actually having the kick and snare be right on time. There is a little bit of variation that we'll cover in the future, but for the most part, some of the main things that make this come out is the hi-hat. Now, typically, whenever you have a hi-hat laid down, it's usually kind of on every 8th note or 16th or whatever, but something that you can try in order to make this kind of have a sense of swing is to variate the second hi-hat or every other hi-hat on here. So if you take a listen to this, every other hi-hat is a little bit late, and that kind of gives it that sense. Everything else on here, though, is pretty much bang on grid. Now, you'll notice that there are a couple ghost kicks here, and this one is actually just a division of 1/16th or maybe 1/32nd of a note, and then this actually second kick is lined up with that off-time hi-hat. And so something interesting that you might want to try out is whenever you have these kind of hi-hats that are laid out, you can actually paste some kick or snare or piece of percussion over that in order to make these kind of line up in that way. So the next beat over here is this one. Now, this one is pretty much pretty simple, and everything is actually bang on grid except for a couple of things. The first one being that these two kicks right here are kind of giving it that nice little rolling feeling. Ba-da-boom, bum, bum, bam, bum, boom, bum, bum, bam. But one other thing that you might notice is that I actually have another snare layer on here on every single beat. So even though it's not the same snare, if we take a listen to here, this snare is actually helping us keep time. So The other thing that's helping us kind of add a little bit of motion to this is that we've actually got a break layered over this. And if we take a listen right here, this is what this sounds like. And together, even though most of this is pretty much on grid, this has a little bit of character, which we'll kind of look at in a little bit more in the future as well. Next up, we've got beat 3, which sounds like this. Now, the main aesthetic behind this is that the kick and snare are bang on the 1 and 2. But because we have something that's helping us keep time between the kick, snare, and then also our crash cymbal or our open hat, that means that no matter what we place in between all of these, we can actually get away with it because it's an off-grid cycle, or it's something that is kind of cycling through in that way. And so we can pretty much allow ourselves to go crazy with the hi-hats because we always know that even though it's off time, it's always going to be cycling rhythmically and repeating at the exact same time. And so that can kind of give us some leeway in order to kind of imply some, how do you say, some swing without like destroying the whole entire beat. Cool. Next up, we've got beat number 4, which sounds like this. So this one in particular has this kick that's right here. And you want to make sure that whenever you do ghost notes on this, you kind of want to make sure that it's at a lower velocity, because that's kind of usually how a drummer would normally do it. So it wouldn't be like boom, boom, boom. It would be boom, boom. The other thing that we have here is I've actually gone and made my own break in addictive drums, and it kind of sounds like this. And then we've also got some vinyl under this. Now, part of the significance behind this was I wanted to see if I can get away with making some of my own custom, like quote-unquote old school drum breaks in order to give myself some nice boom bap feels. But even though it's not quite as lined up as something like this other break that we had, it's still something that is usable and original that I can use to create my own unique beats without actually having to sample. Everything else is pretty much the same though. It's just a straight layer between all the other elements, and that extra break on the top just gives it a little bit more motion. Beat number 5. You might know this one. Wonder mine. Oh no, I'm just kidding. The way that this works is actually, for the most part, the snare is actually playing on the, I guess, like 8th division between the 2 and the 3. So if you have 1, 2, 3, you're actually going to place that snare right here on a dotted rhythm, and that's kind of what helps give it that swing feel. The kick here, it actually has pretty much a bang on grid here, but it goes and splits between a on beat hit and a triplet, and that little moment right there is kind of what helps give it that boom 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 boom. And you can see here that the open hi-hats are on the fundamentals of the drums on each hit. So there's one on the kick, on each snare, and then that's pretty much it. The reason why I don't have 2 little open hi-hats on these is because these are technically considered ghost notes on that. It's not like a major thing. One thing that I wanted to mention about this too is that it's really important to realize like what the focus of the rhythm is. And for this particular beat in itself, we're really putting emphasis on the 1 because that's what has the most space. Boom, ka, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, ka, boom, ka. And so that's kind of why a lot of times within like halftime music or something, you'll always have like a bass on this downbeat because it's got the most space to kind of fill, if that makes sense. So keep that in mind if you guys are ever making those kinds of things, and I'll be sure to write that down for myself as well, or just refer back to the video. Here's the next one. It's kind of that same halftime feel, it's just kind of presenting itself in a different vibe. And so with this one, we're actually pushing this kick a little bit early as opposed to replacing it with that snare. And then everything else is actually also on grid, sans this little triplet kick right there. So it would be boom, ka, ka, boom, ka. But instead, we're replacing that with the kick. We're also replacing this with a different layer snare, so that way this one is different than the first. So snare 1, and then we have snare 2 layer. This is a very subtle layer, by the way, but if we were to turn this up, then you can kind of hear in one way or another that it's actually layered. So you have something that Shroomhead you'd call TikTok snares. I love that term. It works so well. I'm totally stealing it, but he's the one that I heard it from first. Next up, on beat number 7, we've got this one. So this one's kind of similar to the first beat that we had. I pretty much layered these hi-hats over here and kind of made the kicks on here line up with those hi-hats. However, the 1 and then the 2 are also still on beat, but by playing this rhythm here, we kind of allow ourselves to have a little bit of a lo-fi feel. And then keep in mind for that triplet kick right there as well, that kind of helps us have that nice swing on the turnaround. Nice and simple. So this one, I don't know if you guys have heard of Flying Lotus's Camel. It's one of my favorite tunes, but on this one in particular, we actually have a kick on every beat, kind of like a house tune, but we've got ourselves a little bit of swing that comes from these triplet kicks right here. So if you take a listen to this one, now, this kick on these ducat, so that motion right there, that little boom, 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 that's kind of the aesthetic between this, aside from the kick being on every beat. However, you'll see that there is just a little bit of offset on this kick, and that just gives it a little bit more motion within that. To kind of help further accentuate this, I pseudo created like an extra rhythmic percussion thing to help kind of accentuate what you would be going for. But again, this was inspired by Flying Lotus Camel. I'm not saying that this is a recreation, but this is kind of how you can get that type of feel to it. There's no side chaining on this, by the way. There should be, but it's fine. So if you wanted kind of like a beat like that, that's a little bit off time. Everything is mostly in time, but this percussion layer right here is kind of what will help you give that a little bit more offset. And then just moving that boom, boom, that first kick of that movement right there, just a little bit over, as you can see right here. All right, next up, we've got this beat. So the main aesthetic behind this one is that we've got a triplet kick right here that goes boom. And then in the same way, we're actually abusing these two hats right here to fill something in just because we have the space. So we've created this pattern of boom, boom, bop, boom, boom, bop. And in between, we actually have free reign to kind of do whatever we want just because that cycle is there. So whenever you are trying to break a rhythm, if you establish it first with something like this, then it kind of gives you leeway to give yourself a little bit of skip, if that makes sense. So this one is kind of just offset on its own thing. I think that I just turned the grid off between these two notes. This is also kind of set off as a triplet. So this is just one of those ghost snares that you can use, and you can also turn it off, but it adds a little bit of extra character between that. But again, it still implies to the same thing that you have this space to work with. So only like a certain part of this rhythm can have like super swing on it before you go back into the same thing. So for this one, everything except for the first kick is moved a little bit late. Everything except for this second hit right here. So this is actually a little bit early, and that's because as things go a little bit ahead, it starts to seem super late. This kind of helps it catch back up and give you like a little bit of a break in between this to kind of keep that rhythm going. And I think that like you kind of have to be careful with this, and like there's a certain amount of tactile that you have to have whenever you're kind of creating beats like this in order for them to work, because if this is actually on time here, or if the whole thing is late, it almost makes it seem like the whole entire rhythm collapses. Like that kind of works, but for me, I think that part of the magic that this comes with is having that little moment right here a little bit forward, so that way it kind of helps everything gel together a little bit better. But kind of like what we were talking about before, the emphasis is on the kick on the one, and then everything else kind of plays out as it's being lazy or sloppy or drunk. This one is probably one of my favorites. This is actually your typical boom bap beat in my opinion, and one of the magical things behind this is the break that we're using, and then also just the way that the beat is laid out in general. So it sounds like this. So part of this that makes this work is having that triplet kick right here on that turnaround. Ba-boom, boom, boom, ba-boom, boom, pop, da-boom, ba-boom, pop, have. Having a big snare and a big kind of kick, and like for this in particular, this break has a little bit of reverb that's high passed. If you just listen to it on its own, it does have some processing on it, but this really adds a ton of character to the rest of the break if you listen to this. So if you have access to some old school breaks or something, then you can just add a high pass to them, make it mono, and then add some reverb at the end of it, and that will give you a lot of character between that to give it that old school kind of boom bap vibe. There is a little bit of an accent right there, but that's kind of just a triplet right there. And you're kind of like, it's cool because you have a little bit of a mix between stuff that's on grid and then stuff that has like a perfect swing to it. So like, just because you have swing onto something doesn't mean that you have to do like triplets on the whole entire thing. You can just make one little moment like that a little bit off, or have a little bit of perfect swing in that sense. Yeah, that one works out pretty well. Now this one is kind of like, if you've heard Roberta Flack of Flying Lotus or so, this one is more so about the shakers, about that pattern, which I'll open this up in a second, but it sounds like this. Now, I don't have nearly as many clap layers and stuff as that tune, and like there's no bite or grit to it, but the rhythm is what I'm concerned about. But kind of in the same way, we've pushed the second kick or the ghost kick a little bit late, and then on this one as well, this kick is on grid and these are also a little bit late. And you'll notice that this one is also a little bit late as well. And so you kind of have free reign over these kicks or whatever, because you have this consistent, even though it's a little bit off, shaker. You've got the consistent kick snare. So kick, snare, kick, ghost, snare. Within the shaker, one thing that I like to use Vital for, or Serum or whatever, is by taking advantage of the multi-stage envelope that you have within here. So by adding 4 points right here that are on grid and kind of changing the shape on a white noise, you can kind of create your own shaker. Just by adding an LFO onto the level here, and that will kind of give you some cool off shaker, you know, or like kind of off swingy shaker beats type thing. And I like to do this with the high pass and some chorus and just some moderate processing and stuff. But this allows me to get that cool kind of like swingy shaker thing that sounds a little bit more alive, as opposed to just taking a shaker sample and then just playing it, you know, 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4, or doing the opposite and trying to move everything off a little bit to try to get like this weird, you know, kind of shaker vibe. This just allows me to push F and win. So yeah, those are 12 different hip hop type beats. Hopefully this was super helpful to you. I think that this is something that I'm going to be referencing in the future as I try to continue my hip hop endeavors. But let me know what you think. Was this useful to you? Do you guys have something that you would like to add to this? I would love to know, because I mean, really, I'm trying to pop off the knowledge of, you know, figuring out this whole halftime game, figuring out how to make better lo-fi beats, better West Coast beats, all that stuff. So thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.